The Bengal Famine of 1943 serves as an example of one of the worst and most fatal atrocities in modern history. It is also the only famine in India that is recognized to be caused by man-made factors. Greed, complacency, and even racism all played a role. It claimed the lives of 2 to 4 million Bengalis. It reduced the appearance of otherwise healthy men, women, and children to skeletons. Like life, history is complicated. History merely seeks to record life, so it must be. History tells us that its celebrated figures can be capable of both immense bravery, but also shocking inhumanity. The story of the Bengal famine drives this concept home, forcing us to re-examine past beliefs and arrive at more nuanced conclusions about such figures. Join us as we uncover this extremely tragic and difficult history. Bengal is a region located in southern Asia on the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent. After the partition in 1947, it was divided up between India and Pakistan. Before that, it was under the control of the British Raj and was under its rule during the Second World War. A common worry among British politicians and military officials in early 1942 was a potential strategic Japanese invasion of India and Bengal specifically. Colonial Burma, which bordered Bengal, had been taken by the Japanese in March 1942, and they have been bombing some Bengali cities. As the border between Bengal and Burma became the eastern front of the war effort as a result, rice supplies were reassigned from Bengal to feed Allied troops situated on the border. So, the Japanese occupation and consequently British requisition of rice supplies had the effect of drastically reducing provisions of Burmese rice to the region on which it was previously heavily reliant. Anxious of invasion, then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered that food provisions to India, and specifically Bengal, were blocked, if not significantly reduced. This was to prevent Japanese access to ready-made supplies in the event of an invasion. Boats were also burned to prevent easy access, which damaged the ability of the region to receive food imports. Fishermen and boatmen also lost their livelihoods as a result. While some have attributed the cause of the famine to natural factors such as drought and a dearth of favorable conditions for staple food crop production, many historians have since demonstrated that during the famine period, rainfall was higher than average and crop yields were at a normal level. It is fair to say that food supplies in India, in general, had already begun to be severely depleted through British imperial involvement, as foodstuffs were exported to Britain to provide financing for its industry. In the early 1900s, yearly per capita food consumption, or food consumption by person, was around 210 kilograms. By the 1930s, this figure had been reduced to just 130 kilograms. The role of the war served to make this problem worse. It had ravaged transport and logistical facilities, making much-needed food harder to distribute, causing its price to rise as a result. The costs of Allied war presence in India, it was decided by the colonial government, would be covered by indirect taxes upon Indian constituents, which came in the form of inflation. War saw inflation rise dramatically, and the price of rice went up as much as 300%, meaning the poorest were simply unable to afford it, as wages remained at the same level. Economic anthropologist Jason Hickel has argued that this unchecked inflation was a deliberate policy by the British to divert spending power away from the poor people towards the military, as any profits raised by businesses selling the now extremely expensive rice were taxed by the British to support the war effort. Indeed, from the period 1939 to 1944, the British extracted as much as $20 billion worth of income from India. Food for poor Indians was diverted away from them to feed the hundreds of thousands of British, Indian, American, and Chinese troops who were sent to the region after Japan's invasion of Burma. Recent concerns over editing history are justified, and this atrocity, largely overshadowed by Britain's war success, helps to provide a fuller picture of the sacrifice made during the war by millions of Bengalis who had no say in the matter, as it was imposed upon them in large part by the decisions of British politicians. If you want to see more videos that are willing to uncover difficult but vitally important parts of history, please like and subscribe to support the channel, and continue to follow along with us on our journey to create a more thoughtful society through the teaching of history. Winston Churchill is rightly revered as an inspirational figure whose courage in standing up to Germans was a key factor in the defeat of the Nazis during World War II. However, history has consistently demonstrated to us that even some of its greatest figures had deep and even perhaps unforgivable flaws. Churchill's role in perpetuating the famine helps us explore the nuances of this great figure in history. Churchill's wartime cabinet was warned repeatedly by politicians in both India and Britain that the extensive appropriation of Indian resources to support the war effort would result in famine and many, many deaths. There were possible alternatives that could have been used. It is estimated that using their resources instead, Britain and the US could have taxed their citizens at around £1 per person to facilitate a similar level of support for the Allied war effort. In response to concerns about the sheer mortality the famine instigated by British policy, Churchill is quoted by historians as having said the problem was only a problem because Indians were breeding like rabbits. Early on in 1942, Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, had been petitioning Churchill's cabinet to increase food aid to India, and made the argument that, so far as shipping is concerned, the import of food, to my mind, is just as, if not more important, than the import of munitions. However, Churchill ignored Amery's request. In a diary entry, Amery was mystified at Churchill's inaction, writing that Churchill makes no sufficient allowance for the sense of empire responsibility in this country. Not all blame for the famine can be attributed to Churchill, who was operating in the context of a wholly unprecedented military situation. There were also likely some crop shortages due to environmental factors that played a role, but on their own, they were not significant enough to result in a famine of this magnitude. If the famine had occurred in peacetime, it would never have been nearly as severe or even happened in the first place. During the war, however, Churchill was fatally indifferent towards its effect, a factor which helped to result in the deaths of millions of Bengalis, with their unchosen sacrifice now an uncomfortable stain in British imperial history. It was claimed at the time by both the British colonial government and local Indian governments that food hoarding by Bengali individuals and businesses was a factor in the famine. People profited off death by hoarding food supplies and selling them to the highest bidder at vastly inflated prices. The 1945 Famine Commission report, which examined the causes of the famine, determined that an atmosphere of fear and greed played a role in raising the price level of rice. The Commission also recognized that enormous profits were made out of the calamity, and, in the circumstances, profits for some meant death for others. However, while these practices were present, they were not prevalent enough to play any significant role in the famine. After the local government mandated fines for any instances of hoarding food supplies, only a small number of traders were fined, suggesting that there was no large-scale speculative hoarding. The report was also heavily critical of the local Bengali government in its role in perpetuating the famine. A decision in favor of decontrol was taken in March 1943. Decontrol was a policy carried out by the Bengali government that relied upon unrestricted free trade as a remedy to the crisis. However, what was needed was a strong willingness for the government to heavily control trade, so that it was ensured food supplies would reach those most at risk from death by starvation, the poorest Bengalis situated in the lowest socio-economic positions. However, while these factors did play a role, it has to be recognized that the 1945 Bengal Famine Commission report was a British endeavor, and all of its members were appointed by the British government of India. Notably, the report failed to properly attribute blame to the policies of denial and lack of support by the British colonial regime. most of the blame was given to the Bengali, majority Muslim, government. The report should be viewed as a tactic to quell a growing nationalist and anti-imperial sentiment in India by framing the famine as a disaster caused primarily by a Muslim-majority government, thus directing attention away from the role of the British. The Bengal famine serves as an example of the effects of indifference by those situated at the top of power structures. While great historical figures such as Winston Churchill are rightly revered for their bravery, it is our duty as historians to provide a more nuanced depiction of them, to recognize the suffering and sacrifice they inflicted upon innocent people. The famine was not caused by Indians breeding like rabbits, but rather the fatal indifference of those at the top of the British imperial regime.